First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to Israel. I've had an absolutely fantastic week. It's been fascinating, so just to say thank you for that. It's really been great. So this is a paper very much about Great Britain, but I think there may be some, from what I hear, there may be some kind of resonance here for Israel. And it would be extremely interesting, I don't know whether it's possible to redo this analysis for Israel and see if some of the same patterns hold. So, as in Israel, there's a lot of discussion of problems of low social mobility in Britain. And I think that's partly because we are kind of obsessed with class. So we've been talking about these issues for a long time. And the issue's been magnified in several ways more recently. Firstly, because, as we'll see through my analysis, there's been some fall in intergenerational income mobility for these cohorts that we're going to look at. So that's made people very interested. So that's the kind of copula effect potentially that Alan highlighted. In addition, we also have some questions about absolute mobility. So even though the picture that I showed you seemed rather rosy, there's been some recent kind of downturns in the fortunes, particularly of younger workers compared to older workers, and in general median workers, as you saw with the graph that I presented, that kind of fell off a cliff towards the end. So people are very interested in how younger cohorts are going to fare compared to their parents, and particularly in terms of what we see with the housing market. And both of these issues, particularly the second one, has implications for wealth mobility. If younger cohorts are not earning as much and not accumulating the opportunity to own their own homes to the extent that older people are, will there be substantial wealth mobility, or will it end up being very much more dynastic, so talking about the kind of Piketty story. So we touch on all three of these in this paper. There's a lot of things that we don't do, which I'm sure you're going to kind of notice and comment upon, but this is really a kind of a first kind of look at these issues. So the things that we do is we consider this kind of cross-time shifts in the age structure of home ownership. So we see the proportion of people who own their own homes at given ages just dropping in the UK, and it'd be really interesting to see those figures for Israel, but it sounds like there's a similar pattern going on here. We then look at intergenerational correlations in home ownership, which is not something that's been done very much, although interestingly Stephen Jenkins did it using the Roundtree data that Tony Atkinson collected for the UK. Marcus didn't know that because we were talking about Tony Atkinson the other day. And we kind of fit these into general debates about the situation and the change over time in intergenerational mobility in the UK, and show how this picture on home ownership fits with both analysis on social class, Mia's unfortunately gone, and also the analysis on income. And that's quite interesting. And it allows us to make a start, the analysis that we showed you allow us to make a start on thinking about correlations in wealth mobility. We don't have great data on that, but I think that's there's two directions I think we want to go in after this conference. One is thinking much more about absolute mobility, and it was great to have the opportunity to start that work as prompted by Alan, and also thinking about wealth mobility as well. But this is a first start. So first of all, we're going to look, as I say, about cross-cohort changes in home ownership, intergenerational patterns of home ownership, the importance of parental home ownership for this kind of cross-cohort changes, implications for falling mobility, wealth, and then we'll conclude. So this, I think, is probably the graph that you're going to like the most. Okay, so I'll just put this up and go home. So what you can see, although you can't see the first cohort, I guess that clearly, is particularly for young people, the 20 to 29-year-olds, there's been an incredibly steep deterioration in the proportion of those people who own their own homes from the 1990s, early 1990s till today. That's also been true for the other cohorts, but the older you are, the longer it took to kind of bite you. So, you know, it's also certainly true for people in their 30s as well. It just didn't start quite so quickly. But if you look, the drop between 2007 and 2013, for the people in their 30s owning their own home, that dropped from 64 to 47%, which is a huge change. And but there has been a kind of overall reduction in the number of people owning their own home post-recession. So you do see it for the very oldest groups too, but it's clearly something that's very age structured. I don't know what that would look like for Israel. Anybody got any? And now you can see this by cohort, so you can really see that the cohort you're born in reduces your chance of owning your own home, keeping age constant. So if you compare the same coloured bars, you can see that it's going down for the more recent cohorts. And here's just the same thing in a slightly different way. We just did a regression including cohort effects and those and then cohort time and age effects, and then plotted the cohort effects. And the kind of slightly interesting thing about this is that one of the data points that we're going to use for 1958 seems to be kind of almost a high point of home ownership in the UK. And since then it's deteriorated. Obviously, as you get to more recent cohorts past about 1975, you don't really want to make too much of that because they might not be old enough to really, be able to do. We haven't got as much data for those younger cohorts, but you can clearly see there's a very strong pattern here. And these are my co-author Steve Machin loves these. Makes him really happy. So even though they tell you much the same thing. Well, I suppose the interesting thing here is the kind of the steepness in the more recent cohort of home ownership rates, which is much more pronounced than previously. It used to be the case that people would own their own homes eventually, and now they would get there quicker, and now they're getting there later, and the overall level is lower as well. So that kind of gives you the background and context. It's also worth noting, of course, before anybody asks, that house prices rose very fast over this period. This is the house price to earnings ratio for the UK, and you can see that sort of starting mid to late 90s, it rose quite quickly. If you just looked at prices on their own, they rise even more quickly. I don't like this microphone because it makes you stand too still. Huh? Oh, I have to stand over here. Okay, I'm not one for standing still in general. But you can also notice here, and this will come up later, that the house price for London grew even more quickly, particularly starting in the mid 1990s.
Joe, could you just say what the year of the first peak is?
Oh, around? This peak, that's just before the housing price crash in the late 1980s.
Late 1980s.
Yeah, late 1980s. Okay. Well, I could hold it, but I don't think it's working.
No, it's working.
Oh, is it? Okay. So the data that we based our analysis on is this cohort data for 1958 and 1970. So the 1970 data was the one that I used for looking at Alan Kruger's analysis. And the kind of nice thing about this, from our point of view, is that it provides data on both parents and children's home ownership status, which is not very common actually in the data. Although, I guess the PSID would have this, or something like that, but you wouldn't get massive sample sizes. So we've previously shown that intergenerational income correlation strengthened between these cohorts. This was in a book that Miles produced in 2004, so this is kind of old news, although obviously we're able to look at these cohorts a little bit older now. So it's two cohorts of people who were born in a single week, two different weeks. They started up with about 18,000 observations for each of them. They've been followed up periodically. In previous analysis, we've looked at things like whether they're, the attrition rates are differential, etc. And it's not great, but it's not too bad. So you do lose a lot of this initial 18,000, as you might expect. Mobility literature is concentrated on looking at social class at ages 10, 11, and family income at age 16. Now there's very much a parallel analysis going on with what Mia presented yesterday with these Goldthorpe class measures. But I won't show you the results of here, but I'll show you something that looks very much, gives you the flavour of it. And so these cohorts have been quite used quite a lot for intergenerational analysis. And we're now adding this extra piece of information about housing tenure. And we're looking at people at age 42. Okay, so we're hoping that we're going to get round some of the life cycle bias type stuff when people mature. Okay, this is really striking, and again, I could probably just present that chart and this chart and then go home. But it seems a long way to come to do that. So here we can see that parents that children of parents who owned their own home at age 16 were more likely to own their own home at age 42 in the first cohort. You'd probably expect that. What's quite striking is that the proportion of people who own their own home has dropped slightly in the second cohort, but it's dropped really strongly for those whose parents didn't own their own home. Okay? So it's really, you know, it's bad to be young, but it's really bad to be young if your parents didn't own their own home. So there seems to be something going on about parents somehow insuring their children against these cohort-based changes. Okay? That's quite striking, I think. So here we've just got some regression analysis which kind of shows you the same thing and shows you that we're not doing anything funny. Okay? So we can take the home ownership measure of parents from different ages. These are actually linear probability models, but it doesn't make any difference if you do it with probits or indeed we've done some odds ratios on these as well. And what you see is that if your parents own their own home, you're about 13 percentage points more likely to own your own home in the 58 cohort and about 20% more likely to own your own home in the 70 cohort. And that's a fairly substantial difference and obviously statistically significant. We do control for a few things here just to kind of get an impression as to how much difference this makes. We're not trying to kind of get at anything particularly causal here, but we just thought we would take a look. And it doesn't really change anything, but you know, some of this can be explained, the levels, by the fact that people whose parents who own their own home were more kind of able in childhood, but it doesn't explain anything about the change. Okay? And we do it for owning your own home at 10 or 11, 16, and or one or the other of those. So you just get a bit of a broader measure. So what we see is that parental home ownership is becoming more important, and the increase is big. Okay? So if you did do this in odds ratios, the likelihood of a cohort member owning their home, their parents did, compared to a cohort member whose parents did not own their own home, rises from 147% to 191%. Okay? So it's pretty big. The other thing that you can do is compare regression coefficients for owning your own home, your parents owning their own home, or whether you own your own home, on a model of whether you owned your own home or whether your parents were professional or whether your parents were rich. Okay? And when you do that, it's by far more important as to whether your parents owned their own home. Okay? So that's the strongest marker. Because you think that these things were very closely correlated, but it seems that it's owning your own home that's particularly a strong marker, even though a higher proportion of people own their own home than were in the top quintile, so you would think that that would be stronger in some sense. So just to relate this to what we have been learning over the last 15 years about intergenerational mobility in the UK from these cohorts, the first thing that we know is that income mobility fell, and there's been a lot of kind of robustness analysis on this. I mean, it may be that it's these particular cohorts for whom intergenerational mobility fell. Okay? It's possible, but it doesn't seem to be that there's a kind of data flaw in this. And analysis on the same cohorts has shown that for these cohorts, social class mobility did not fall. Okay? So this has led, it's a shame Mir's gone because he had ringside seats to this. There's been quite a lot of discussion between economists and sociologists about why this might be the case. And, you know, there's been a lot of debate about the reason for this different finding between social class mobility remaining stable and income mobility income persistence rising. And, you know, there's been discussion about whether it's measurement error, which we don't think it is, whether it's changing income dynamics within social class, which we think it might be, or whether it's just that they measure something different. Okay? I think the analysis that we've got here on home ownership kind of contributes to this debate a little bit because it's completely independent. You know, in some sense it isn't, but it's an independent measure of these things. Okay, so we can compare here and see if we get the same kind of patterns with our data that we're using. So here's the home ownership, strong increase. The way we did this, I'm actually quite glad Mir's gone because the way we did social class here is a little bit non-kosher in a sense. in that we actually look at the relationship between staying in the same class as your parents across all the different social classes and kind of aggregate that together. Okay, so it's definitely not, it's not log odds type of way of doing it, but it gives you a very similar picture. Okay, and then we have the income mobility regressions here. We know these are probably downward biased in the levels because we've only got one measure of income, but we see again this strong rise. Okay, and we've done a lot of analysis in other papers on whether that's anything to do with measurement error, etc. So I think that's quite an interesting finding in itself, that this kind of analysis of housing tends to support the income picture. It's also interesting in its own way, because of the relationship with overall wealth. So for most people, most of their wealth is tied up in their homes. Okay? And so it therefore seems quite likely that there might be a strengthening relationship between wealth across cohorts in the same way that we see this strengthening relationship between income across cohorts. And we haven't got particularly good measures of wealth in the UK, but we do something that Charles and Hurst did in their paper, which is try and pick up a few things that might be indicative of wealth to provide a bit more support to our analysis. So we've got a few different things here. I can't, of course, remember what they are. Oh, yes. Okay. So the first thing, so this one is just home ownership that we've already seen. We then broaden out our measure of income. We can't get wealth, but we can get a broader measure of income, looking at both spouses to think about the contribution that husbands and wives may make. More interestingly, we look at whether people state that they have savings or investments. Okay? And we can see that there's a stronger relationship between having savings and investments in the second cohort, and both whether your parents own their own home and what their income level was. Okay? We haven't really, home ownership is really the only measure of parental wealth that we have, so we can't do much with that. We have to use just those two. And then the one thing that kind of doesn't really work is whether people own their own business. But in the UK, this might quite commonly be kind of window cleaners and things like that. It's not really getting at large businesses. So we tried to look at people who are self-employed and have somebody working for them, but there's so few that it didn't really work very well. So before I close, I think it's worth kind of commenting on what we could do and don't do at this time. I mean, one thing that we might be interested in here is whether it's just that basically the relationship between home ownership and the relationship between income is very closely tied together because they're both driven by the same thing. Okay? So it could be that your parents are richer, this has more of an effect on your educational attainment in the second cohort, and that has more of an effect on both your own income and whether you own your own home. Although it wouldn't explain why, well, it wouldn't, hang on, I shouldn't think in the middle of giving talks, it's a very, very bad idea. So yeah, we might be interested in that, and that's part of a plausible story, I think, that this is something to do with an increase in intergenerational transmission of human capital. So I tried to do this just before I left, but of course I didn't have the data in exactly the same format, so I wasn't able to do it. It wasn't in the right place at the right time. Another thing that we might be interested in is the fact that parents who own their own home may transmit kind of preferences, etc., to their children of the fact this is an important thing to do. Of course, it's hard to explain why that would have changed, although it may have changed because the kind of returns from owning your own home have changed. So that could be part of the story, although that brings us to the house price issue, in that if your parents own their own home, house prices rose quite strongly, they may be able to actually contribute to you kind of getting a mortgage yourself. And that's important. I think if that's true, that doesn't detract in any way from the fact that we found. Okay? It just kind of it just gives it a slightly different spin. It's not like we're not interested in it because it's that, because that's a fundamental part of the wealth transmission that's going on in the UK. So we haven't got very good data on direct inheritance, but we may suspect that even if it wasn't direct inheritance, there's a thing that's been named recently in the UK as the bank of mum and dad. Okay? So even if parents aren't directly transferring when they die, they might be making these kind of transfers when they're living, and we haven't got good data on that at all. One thing that I thought would be interesting to do in the context of the house price question is to just look a little bit at where house prices rose the most. I need to do a much better job on this, I apologise. I was fiddling about with the Katz-Kruger statistic, I probably should have been doing this. But one thing you can observe, which we've kind of already seen, is a particularly large rise in house prices in London. And also in the rest of the southeast as well, which is the second kind of green line there. I hope this microphone's not too annoying. And so we decided to separate out our kind of intergenerational changes analysis on the regions. Okay, we could do a better job on this by matching them, but basically London and the southeast will be the same in those two different analyses. And what you observe there is a kind of higher transmission of this intergenerational tenure, a higher change in that in London and the southeast than average, but it's not the strongest one, and it's not pulling the whole thing up. So I think that though this may be part of the story, it's not the whole story. But obviously there's more that we need to do on that as we go forward with this analysis. I haven't seen a card flash at me at all. I don't know what that means. I'm on the conclusion, so it's fine, but... No, I don't need one. It just made me think, am I really quick?
Unfortunately, you're just on time.
Oh, it's perfect.
To show you the 10 minutes.
Oh, no. That's perfect. I did think when I was sitting there this morning, I thought, if I'm a little bit short, it's probably fine.
I was awake.
You were completely awake. You were gripped, Ruben. You were gripped. So I think, just to conclude, clearly there's been this very rapid kind of cohort upon cohort deterioration of the prospect of home ownership for these more recent cohorts. And a key feature of that has been whether your parents own their own home or not, it seems. I mean, we would like to be able to look at this for every cohort. We can look at it for 2 cohorts, and it seems that if your parents didn't own your own home, the changes that were happening were worse for you. So I think that's a really interesting fact. And this seems to contribute to the idea that there's been some change in intergenerational income mobility over time. Or certainly it's indicative that there was a change in wealth mobility. Now, it could be that wealth and income were going in completely different directions, but that doesn't seem to be that likely. So it's just beginning to give us a little bit of evidence on wealth that we didn't have. And clearly there's further work that we're going to do on some of the mechanisms that I mentioned, although my co-author says, I love this paper just as it is, don't do any more. But I think we do need to do a little bit more, so I'd be very grateful for any comments. Thank you.
I should preface my remarks by noting that I really know nothing about social mobility and inequality, and I'm here at Ruben's request because I do know something about housing markets. So my, especially the first part of my comments will be more on home ownership than on social mobility. So the first way I think I can contribute is to, excuse me, is just to take note of the small literature that now exists. I mean, there's been papers written all along about home ownership, but more recently there have been a number of papers that have focused on home ownership. A couple of them for the United States, and that particularly are interested in the huge increase in home ownership over the 1940s and the 1950s. So this is this paper here that you see by Chambers et al. It's a computational general equilibrium type paper where they put a lot of emphasis on the government intervention into the mortgage market, I guess during the Depression years, where the standard mortgage was increased to about 30 years, and that allowed greater access to home ownership, in particular for the younger families. So you see on the right, that's not really cohort. Those 1940, 1960 are census years, but you could see, sort of similar to what Joe was showing us, that the big changes are at the at the young age of the age spectrum, and as you get older, the increases are less relevant. Now that, there's two ways of looking at that. One is that it's telling us that a lot of the changes are in the intensive margin of when you become a homeowner. That this allowed families to become homeowners earlier, and less on the extensive margin of ever becoming a homeowner or not. What complicates that is, though home ownership is not ergodic, I think there is there's obviously a huge amount of persistence. So once you become a homeowner, it's probably pretty likely that you remain a homeowner. So there might be less kind of room for adjustment at the higher ages. Let's see, the next article by Feder is really concerned more or less over the same time period, though they emphasize subsidies that were given to Korean War veterans and trying to exploit that to understanding, I guess, the demand for home ownership. But here too, you sort of see that there's a sense in which there's much less movement on home ownership at the older ages, and the big movement on home ownership over time is at the younger ages. Okay. And then, sorry, I keep going the wrong direction. The third kind of empirical results that I want to point out is some results that are presented in a paper by Talamagna and Rady, and this is about the UK market. So you see there, again, the year of it might even be from the same data that you have, I'm not sure. Two different age groups, the 20-year-olds and the 30-year-olds. And of course, 1988, for the exactly the 30, is there a way to shift over the, no?
The amount, make it smaller.
Or make it smaller. Can you do that? For the 30-year-olds, which is kind of this line here, this is Joe's 1958 cohort, okay? But the point in this paper is that the peak of home ownership is in 1988 over that time period. I guess that's probably right before prices fell. That first peak that I was asking about, and you see the big changes for the 20-year-olds. There's very, very small changes for the 30-year-olds. So again, it's showing you that it's in that the 20-year-old age groups that we're seeing big changes. And this, here I'm a little bit bothered by the decomposition that you guys do into a cohort, age, and income effect. And year effect, calendar year effect, which has the property that the age always has the same additive effect wherever you are in time or cohort. And that's not what we're seeing in this data. And I have to admit, this whole cohort age year thing, I last looked up seriously when I was a graduate student concerned with used cars. I found work by Grillicus in the 1950s, and it gave me a headache then, and it still gives me a headache, like a physical headache. So I haven't thought about this too seriously, but I think that's an issue and that's a problem. And I want also to draw your attention to this later paper by Talamagna and Rady, which is the more kind of serious, or more, hardcore theory paper version of this paper, where there is this emphasis on a quality ladder of homes and some young people buying starter homes, and the interaction with credit constraints, and that movements in the credit opportunities are what drives the home ownership. And I think it's worth looking at that literature. There's also another literature that starts from Sine and Solelis and sees ownership as a hedge against a rent risk. And that's being looked at empirically by Michael Amior, who will be joining our department in a few months, and Jonathan Helkin. They're British economists, but they're using American data. So. And then I couldn't stop myself from showing this thing here, because you were also talking about Israeli data, so this is Israeli data, as you might guess. The top graph is showing you home ownership. The bottom graph from 2005 to 2015, the bottom graph is showing you owner occupancy. And I think it is a little bit important to note the distinction. So I think in the paper you're talking really about owner occupancy, but that's not the same as home ownership. So, and now this changes, the gap changes a lot over time, but by 2015, this is telling you that 15% of renters own a home. So I don't know how much of an issue that is in practice, but it's worth at least being aware of. Okay, here I'm going to give you a little bit of grief, and in particular about a particular phrase, and I hope I'm not overdoing it, but you say you're using housing as a marker of wealth. And the motivation of the paper is, well, what we're really interested in is social mobility, and we would really like to this is at least how it's sold in the paper, much less in the presentation. What we're really interested in is knowing what is the intergenerational, I don't know what E stands for, I guess IGW here, in the intergeneration correlation of wealth. We don't have good measures of wealth, and where we do have wealth, it's over a selected sample, and we have much better information about home ownership. So it's wealth that we're interested in, and housing is a marker of wealth. Okay, so here's where I'm going to criticize you. For a marker to be a marker, it needs to be stable. I mean, even if you think of the meaning of the word, it marks a point, on the ground. And my worry is that home ownership is not a stable indicator of wealth. And there's two reasons to be suspicious. One is that the marginal distribution is unstable. We see these, the overall home ownership rate in the UK has been, even before you break it down and condition and so forth, has been unstable. And my guess is, I'm not sure we actually have you obviously don't have a regression like this in the paper. Maybe you should go to some other source and see what you can do. But my guess is that home ownership conditional on wealth, or maybe you want rank of wealth, is unstable over time. And that's a problem, because if the intergenerational transmission of the marker does not imply intergenerational transmission of what it's meant to be a marker of the object of that marker. And that's true even if you've conditioned on income, as you do at some points in the paper. Just two examples, one of which you give in the paper. There could be a taste transmission. I think that's a very interesting notion. I hadn't thought about that before, but that might be going on. There also might be geographical differences in the nature of the housing stock and so forth that also leads to differences in home ownership. And if people tend to live in the areas that their parents lived in on average, then that's going to lead to intergeneral transmission. And I think that's actually something that would be worthwhile to condition on in your work. Now, in addition to that, okay, even if there's no additional thing that's transmitted by the marker over generations, even if the marker is a deterministic function of the object, here wealth, and that function changes over time, which it definitely does, then in my mind you're picking up the wrong thing. And I go back to the second diagram that you advertise as the one thing to take away from this paper. And I really like this diagram. I mean, I think it's really interesting what's going on, but I have a little bit of a different interpretation, okay? So what I'm doing on the left is writing down a data generating process, right? that replicates the right-hand side. So unfortunately, it's cut off. But what you should, the top thing is the income of the parent, and the bottom line is the income of the child, okay? Where there's like a kind of individual effect for the parent X and for the child Y, normally standard normal distribution, and a family, right, effect Z, standard normal distribution. And the 0.7 there means there's an autocorrelation of basically 1/3, okay? And then the rule is that there are these two cohorts here. So there's the adult and the parent here, and there's the adult and the parent here. Okay, that's not what the bars are, but that's, so the adults for the parents for both cohorts have a cutoff rate of -1.4. If their wealth or income, we call it wealth, if their wealth is high enough, they have a home, for both sets of parents. For the first set of children, the people who are 42 and 2000, they have the same cutoff, okay? But for those children who are 42 in 2012, I'm letting the opportunities to buy a home be worse. They have a higher cutoff of -0.9, okay? That generates this diagram, right? This diagram says, if we're looking at people who are 42 in 2000, those people whose parents had a house, they have an 88% chance of having a home. Those people whose parents didn't have a house have a 74. And then if we look at people the same age, but in 2012, 12 years later, their probability of having a house goes down, but only by 8% to 80% if their parents had a home. If their parents didn't have a home, it goes down by a whole lot more, by 58%. So that's generated by this model, and you can see how it generates it. We have the two distributions of wealth for the children whose parents did not have a home, and the children whose parents did have a home. Those scales, the numbers are different, but the scales are the same here, and the vertical scale is the same. What you should see, and it's the same cutoff rates moving from -1.4 for the people who are 42 in 2000 to -0.9 for people who are that same age 12 years later. And you can see that here, because of the basic symmetry of the distribution and that most people have own a home, that this is capturing more people, the movement in the cutoff points. Okay, and that exactly explains why here you get a much greater gap in home ownership between people with homes as children and without homes in this later year, because according to this model, it's just become more difficult to purchase a home. Now I look at this and I say there's no change in social mobility because it's the same autocorrelation that I've assumed here of 1/3. It's the change in is it worthwhile to buy a home, okay, or some interpretation like that, okay. Now I don't think you necessarily have an objection to I would guess to this kind of simple probabilistic representation of your model, but I think the point is that housing is not a stable marker here. It can't be thought of as a stand-in for that its intergeneral transmission is a stand-in for that of wealth. Okay, and then I just want to finish. I have 1 minute, so great. So I'm just going to put everything up here. Here are some explanations for changes in the marginal distribution, and they may help for understanding the changes in the transmission. So one is delayed adolescence. Maybe part of the story that people are not buying homes at the young ages is that they're getting married later, that they don't have permanent jobs, it's just not getting their act together. Right? That seems to be going around. Maybe it's related to movements in urbanization. There's of course changes in the mortgage interest tax deductibility in the UK. It was introduced in 1969. And it was eliminated when Gordon Brown was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in 2000. Maybe that's playing a role. There was mortgage market liberalization in the 1980s, which Otello Magna and Radi are concentrate on. As we were talking about before, there was, the reduction of social housing under Margaret Thatcher. And of course, there's the rise in prices, as you mentioned. But don't forget, as you showed us yourselves, there was a big decline, certainly felt like a big decline in prices after 1989 or what have you, where the mechanism goes in the opposite direction. You own a home, prices go down, maybe you have a big mortgage, you can be completely underwater. You now are in a worse position to transmit a wealth via the home than before. I see that as actually an opportunity for research. I very much like what you started to do with the regional prices. That's not in the paper. And I think that kind of thinking of looking at the various variations interacted with the intergenerational transmission can take you a far away. But I very much enjoyed reading the paper. I learned a lot from it, and I encourage you to convince Steve to do more with this. Thank you.
Take questions from the floor.
Do I need to record for posterity, or shall I just use my voice? Okay. It's interesting work. First of all, I think it's the issue of house ownership may be quite interesting in and of itself, regardless of whether or not you think of it as a marker of wealth. But to the extent you do, I think, and again, a lot of this may already be in the paper, but you might want to rely on wealth surveys to kind of characterize a little more the in a sense, the role of house ownership and across time. In the UK, I think that could be illustrative. And then how much of this you already have done and how much you can do is, I have no idea about. But it might be interesting to do more than just the binary house there, to kind of try to do something about the value of the house, using region, using characteristics of the building and so on, to try to figure out if you could get some additional leverage, essentially impute values to the house, and then take a look at that. But by and large, and then also to try to think, has the kind of position of housing as part of the portfolio choice changed across these periods? Because one of the things you may or may not find is that variability of income has changed across these cohorts, something you can look at using other sources of data. And if that's true, then credit constraints are probably more of an issue for the later cohorts, because the banks are probably less willing to lend to you if you're facing a very much more variable income path than a previous generation was.
So I have two questions from an American perspective. So I mean, because what happened in the financial crisis was there were like 3 million foreclosures, and no doubt that increased the effect of parental home ownership, because if parents had money, they could help the children avoid foreclosure. But then the other thing that happened was the banks tightened up all their lending requirements, and you needed more money, and mortgage insurance went up, and all kinds of things happened that again I would think would have tightened the correlation. But I don't know if the British situation was the same as the American.
Just briefly, I want to remind us all that home-owning parents don't die fast enough anymore.
They may go down in the wealth.
No, but one way of parents financing the home ownership of children in Israel is taking a mortgage on their own home. And that, even if they don't die, they have more access to finance than the children. And that may be, if the British have not invented it yet, should tell them that's the way to go.
Robin, can I add one thing to the list of items that David raised? I was once a homeowner in Britain, and is it working? I was once a homeowner in Britain, and the only thing that mattered was to take advantage of mortgage tax relief. Even if you didn't want a bigger house, you just bought one, because it made no sense to give up this tax relief. I understand now that from what you said that disappeared in 2000. That's one major change, so that the new generation doesn't have that huge advantage of having to get a house to get the tax relief. The other thing was that for vehicles for holding wealth have vastly increased, not just in Britain but everywhere else, including here now. And there wasn't much choice among the parents' generation to do with their wealth. They either bought a house or they didn't buy a house, but now the opportunities of personal investment are much more diversified, not to mention they've become globalized. And so here the economic incentives to be a homeowner in the younger generation have just greatly reduced. And what's puzzling though is why that should be somehow related to whether your parents were a homeowner, because you find that this is goes down. But you really need to put the economic incentive of being a home ownership into the model somehow.
I'm a sociologist, so I think housing has more than simply economic value. I actually like the paper very much, and I, regardless of whether it does represent wealth or not, I think it's an important issue. Housing has a lot of social aspects like stability. Different societies may have different views about the importance of housing. Israel, for instance, historically has a very strong emphasis on home ownership as a way of keeping people in the country and not emigrating. And there is actually a paper, it's quite old, in the United States by Henrietta, and I forget his colleague, about the taste issue, showing that actually there is a difference in taste between children of homeowners and non-homeowners. One point I want to raise, and I don't know how far you can go with your data, and at least in Israel, homeownership is closely linked to coupling, marriage in particular. So it's more an issue that comes up at a particular situation. So obviously when the marriage is delayed, as it has become over generations, it will have an impact on the timing of starting or trying to start home ownership. By the way, in Israel there has been a very serious reduction in home ownership in the younger cohort compared to their, say, 30 years ago or something. The other thing of interest, I think, with housing, when you're looking at housing, if it is linked to marriage, that means the interesting thing is the parents of both spouses. So it's not only an individual aspect like we think about of intergenerational transmission of, say, education, but also a matter of who marries whom, and say whether the parents of both spouses were owners or not, and may have a difference. I don't know if you have any information about couples that would be able to sort of look at that, but I think it's important. In a small study that we did some time ago in Israel, we saw a very big difference in the likelihood of ownership between couples whose none of their parents had home ownership, one of the parents had, or both parents had. So that even increases that likelihood.
Okay, so I think we are ready to move to the last session.
It's okay.
Do you want to?
No. Just thank you very much. And there were a couple of points there about the relationship between wealth and housing in the UK that I think we do need to investigate that further. But the idea that young people are choosing not to own a home is not really familiar from a UK background. It's not like they think it's not worth it. They're desperate to do it, but they can't. I think that's probably the most important point. But I really thank you very much. Could you send me your slides, David? That'd be really useful, especially. I don't think that your data exercise means it doesn't matter, but I think we've got to look at that. That was really helpful. Thank you.